Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. I'm joined by Mickey from Ori, the head of sales engineering, and I'm Caleb Waddles, a product manager at HID. And the topic today is identity at an inflection point. Honestly, I think identity has quietly become one of those overloaded terms in technology. People hear identity and they immediately think of MFA prompts, password policies, maybe a support queue held together by expired coffee resets and duct tape. But identity really has evolved beyond that. It really sits now, I would say, kind of at this blast radius between security, user experience, workforce productivity, compliance, operational efficiencies, and of course, digital trust. And it's become one of those central control surfaces, whether organizations intended or not, which creates this really uncomfortable reality. And that's the organizations are trying to build this modern digital experience on top of authentication infrastructure, which was really designed for a different era. And that's really the focus of today's discussion. We intentionally want to keep this business focus and talk through the broader shift that's happening in the industry today. And we're going to touch on a couple key themes. Why identity models are under strain, why passkeys and phishing resistant authentication are reshaping expectations, and what businesses should prioritize as they modernize. Um, so with that as our background, let's go ahead and let's talk through some of these ingredients that is putting identity at an inflection point. And let's start with the rising threat landscape. Um, Mickey, you wanna tell us about what you're seeing there?
Yeah, no, sounds good. And I'll make a similar joke to yourself, right? So I've been doing identity at this point now for I don't know 15 or 16 years. And I always like to make this joke, right? It's always at an inflection point. I feel like every 2 years we like to say identity is at an inflection point. And I think the reason for that is that more and more people, like you're saying, they're realizing that security, as we look at it, does rely on identity, right? A lot of people, like you said, they're like, oh, look, it's identity, it's the username and password stuff. But at the end of the day, identity and access management is all about like if you have a bunch of things that you need to do access control for and you need to control them differently, that means you need to identify them. And once you've identified them, you need a way to prove that they are the thing they say they are. There's your authentication, no matter what you've done to do it. There's your authentication part, why it's necessary. And then now that you identify them, you treat them differently. These sets of things over here can do X, these sets of things over here can do Y. And that's pretty much all it is. And I think why it's constantly at an inflection point is we constantly realize there are more and more things that we need to identify. And because we're identifying more things or assigning identity to more things, we start to realize there's more and more fine-grained things, more and more fine-grained authorization that we need to control about these different identities, right? Whether they be non-human identities or AIs or just humans or workforce or employees or extended workforce, right? All of that piled together is just hey, there's a lot of things out there. They all have different reasons to exist. They all have different jobs they need to do. We need to make sure that they're only allowed to do those jobs. And that, to me, goes right into that rising threat landscape, right? Because every time we pour more into identity, which we should, right, we start to realize that it comes with different attacks. It comes with different types of threats, right? When we talked about, we talk about SIAM or we talk about employee, right? Credential attacks. They've been around for forever. Someone trying to figure out someone's password, right? Someone's trying to clone someone's SIM so that they can get the one-time password if you really want to get advanced, right? Phishing attacks, account takeovers continue to rise. All of these things, right? Not only are they continue to arise and evolve, they're getting faster and easier. I will pick on AI. I know that might be beating a dead horse or everybody saying AI this and AI that, but at the end of the day, two things I don't think anybody would argue is that AI will allow the smart people, the smart hackers, to carry out more complicated, sophisticated hacks. And that should be the scary part. But I think the scariest part is it'll allow the not so sophisticated hackers to carry out what used to be considered sophisticated attacks in higher volumes, right? I mean, that's the biggest thing about AI. It's kind of lowering the bar for a lot of things. And one of those things will be, hey, those attacks that used to be few and far between because it took an expert to carry them out, that kind of moves down. And that also means that those attackers can start creating, more advanced attacks. So I think it's going to be very interesting to watch this rising threat. And as our entire ecosystem evolves, and as we expose more and more services to partners and B2B things and users and our employees, right? Each one of those are going to come up with their own interesting attacks and own new attack vectors that we have to stay on top of.
Yeah, that's interesting, and I kind of want to circle back on a point that you made, which is that we're always at this inflection point, and you also made this point too that if you look at these attacks that's right here on the screen, credential attacks, phishing, account takeover, these are all the traditional problems. But you have this whole new dimension, right, with AI and deep fakes, and it's an entirely new dimension. And you highlighted or you touched on it. You have more sophisticated attacks. The speed at which those attacks are happening is more rapid. And of course, it's just the sheer scale and volume that the organizations face. Like you said, you have the smart guys doing more sophisticated stuff, and you have the not so smart guys basically industrializing those attacks and just blasting sheer amount of volume at organizations now. And it's a really interesting point. That leads us to the next ingredient in identity at an inflection point, which is the user expectations are changing. And for years, security has operated around the idea that there's always this trade-off between security and usability, right? And historically, stronger security usually meant more friction for the user. But over time, technologies like risk-based authentication, push authentication, and now passkeys, it's really abstracting or reducing that trade-off significantly. So I would say that the technology shift is itself no longer entirely new. What is kind of new, I would say, is maybe the pressure that people are placing on the enterprises to effectively up their game. Uh, customers are familiar with these consumer platforms or these consumer user experience, which is basically normalized these experiences at massive scale. And users are now accustomed to authentication flows that feel seamless, fast, frictionless, all while being very secure. So increasingly, you have users who expect the same experience, right, when they show up to work. And frankly, this is going to be the case whether organizations are ready for that or not. And I think this is a great segue to passkeys. So if you want, Mickey, maybe you can talk us through how you see passkeys reshaping authentication.
Yeah, definitely. Passkeys are the new, I'll say the new hot thing. I personally like them, right? Because it's one of the easiest and frictionless ways to do very secure authentication at this point in time. If you guys have done this a while, right, you've probably remembered every couple of years, someone says, "Hey, we're going to get rid of passwords." We still haven't done it. It's been 16 years or so. We still haven't completely gotten rid of passwords. We moved on we tried FIDO for a while, love FIDO, right? But a lot of times it required someone to carry around a token, right? Carry around a physical token. We tried with WebAuthn, right, which works as long as you have a newer device at the end of the day, because we want it to do things like the Windows Hello or the touch on the Apple, right? And then now we've kind of evolved into passkeys. Now, what's cool is that a lot of all of those that I just mentioned, they all have something in common, right? They're kind of cryptographic authentication at the end of the day. You're going to send something in, it's going to be signed with a key at the end of the day, and then it's going to return back that signature. It's going to check and make sure that the user is authenticated, what makes passkeys a lot better, at least in my opinion, or a lot easier for end users at the end of the day, right? You can use those cross device if you need to, right? You can set up passkeys in a way to where you can still get that strong security of having a different complete physical factor, right? But still be able to move from mobile to web or desktop to mobile or mobile back to desktop. If you set the things up right, you can actually switch back and forth. So that's why they're probably one of my favorites, is because they kind of solve that. It's like, hey, each one of its devices becomes its own, cryptographic signer at this point in time. And for an end user, if you as an organization has set this up right as an end user, it becomes super easy, right? No matter where I'm at, GitHub is probably one of my favorite implementations of this, right? No matter where I'm at, I go to GitHub, pops up QR code, I can scan it, I can get on my buddy's computer, do something real quick, sign out, go over to one of my servers, sign into GitHub, scan the QR code, use the passkeys, right? That passkey is staying on my phone, right? It's not my credentials that are moving around. It's not credentials that are flying across the web, right? It's literally the signature using the passkey. So I think a lot of people are going to As soon as they start figuring out how easy it is to set these up, implement these, right? And as soon as end users start realizing how easy it is once you've set up a passkey to use it, I think they're really going to start reshaping the way we think about authentication. That'll be everyone's go-to versus the one-time passwords.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're exactly right. It's this mainstream authentication method that genuinely challenges the need for shared secrets altogether. You think about it, even traditional MFA, you still had this, you still kept shared secrets at the center of the user experience. The password, in some cases, even with OTP, you have a shared secret model. But passkeys change all of that, right? And for years, the industry talked about eliminating passwords. I mean, this is a drum that's been beaten for the past decade or so, but never really has there been a practical and broadly supported path to get there. And passkeys really do change that. It's been a long time in coming, right? I mean, it didn't happen overnight, but now the ecosystem really has matured to the point where, passwordless authentication is operationally viable across the board. You mentioned GitHub. Yeah, it's pretty much everywhere. So that's very exciting to see. And I think this leads us to our final ingredient that puts us at an inflection point, which is the legacy architectures are simply under strain. So you add all these pressures together that we talked about, and it really does become clear that many legacy identity systems, they don't cut the mustard anymore. At face value, I think most organizations have recognized that. What's probably less obvious, though, is that unless you've lived through this modernization effort firsthand, is that whatever your next step is, you have to account for the gravity of the existing environment that you have. And legacy systems, you have fragmented business units, you have integrations, workflows, policies, operational dependencies that are just all over the map. And all of that has to come along for the ride. I think very few organizations really have the luxury of starting from a clean slate. I would say that's sort of our baseline assumption here is that most organizations are starting from a point that has, a massive authentication legacy to contend with. And I think that's something that we should double click into. As a topic we can double click into a bit. And Mickey, if you will, maybe talk us through what you're seeing in the industry today.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And it's like you said, right? Every time there's an inflection point, every time there's an evolution of stuff, right? All of us, especially people who work for the larger organizations and larger companies, right? They're not just dealing with the new stuff, like you said, they're dealing with 20, 30 years of old applications that are still critical. They just haven't been rewritten yet, right? And that identity infrastructure still has to support it. Right. But then you also turn around and you want all the newer stuff that's faster, maybe it's more secure. It's definitely easier to set up these days, easier to consume, right? But there's always that back and forth that's going to go on, just like the user experience, the security thing, right? It's always going to be that back and forth of like modernization versus, hey, I got this 20-year-old legacy app that still has to work to this day. Some of those you might be scared to actually touch. But what we're seeing with that, right, is it is causing, the hidden cost of it, right? I've seen a lot of identity programs out there from the outside. They look amazing. They look great. They have all the things that we're talking about. There's no complaints. The user experience is great. The outside security is great. But then when you go look at all of that legacy infrastructure that they've had to bolt together these last few years to make it work that way, it's got a lot of hidden business costs, right? There's a bunch of organizations out there. We did a little bit of a survey, right? And 47% cite rising and unpredictable IAM cost, right? And that's to me, that's a good indication that you're at an inflection point. That's basically a lot of experts who have done this a long time saying, we're not really sure what IAM is going to cost us in the next 5 years. We know it's probably going to explode even more. We know that we're going to put a lot more burden on top of it, whether it be, bigger machine to machine stuff, better offerings for customers, whether it just be, AI again. I know I'm bringing it up, but AI still needs an identity. AI is still going to be doing things on behalf of users and behalf of employees, right? So they're just like, we don't know what it is. We don't know what it's going to cost. We don't know how much strain it's going to put on there. We know it's going to put a strain, but what is that? Slower, and the second thing is, right, slower innovation, right? Old IAM makes it hard, right? When you're dealing with older IAM stuff, it does make it hard to innovate. It makes it hard to change. Some of those legacy systems that I've seen out there have they're like first gen IAM tools that are out there. They barely support OAuth without bolting multiple things on top of them, and it just slows everything down at the end of the day. We're also seeing things like fragmented user experiences, which That's still common to this day. Sometimes I go to the web and it's a completely different sign on than when I go to the application. And I don't mean just like applications are easier for trusting security. I just mean like it goes through two completely different flows. Even the risk that's behind it, the risk evaluation behind it to figure out if it wants to do multi-factor, are two completely different flows. And that's just adding complexity that may or may not need to be there. It's also, there's increased risk exposure, right? 41%, report security and reliability concerns, right? And that just kind of goes back to they're not sure how it's going to explode in the next couple of years. Unexpected IAM costs, right? That's all about that explosion and that expansion of IAM. But then it also goes back to this, right? When you're going that fast and you're moving that fast, it's like, are we triple sure that everything is secure? We've just launched 20 new services, right? We just launched the support for AI. We just launched the support for more B2B stuff, right? Are we triple sure that we've reinforced exposure from the old stuff, phishing, credential theft, and the new stuff, right? And then last but not least, limited visibility. And I would actually say 32, it says 32% site compliance and data resiliency limitations. I would say this is probably one of the most important ones on the screen, right? Limited visibility and control, because before you can fix a lot of that other stuff, you need visibility. If you can't see it, you can't secure it. If you can't see everything, you can't start seeing the gaps in the system that you need to start patching up. And I think that leads us right into when we're talking about how are we going to fix this, right? What should business leaders be looking to prioritize? I think that leads us right into our next slide. Like, how do we start fixing this, or how do we think people should start fixing this, Caleb?
Yeah, that's right. And I think we'll start with the punchline here first, in that, modern identity should create business value. It shouldn't just be this thing that you bolt on as technical compliance. If you look around, it's kind of like the threat landscape in some ways, in that, in some ways, AI can be a threat, but it can also, in of itself, be kind of an opportunity or a solution to create business value. And we're going to walk now through some of these priorities that business leaders should be considering as they look to how they're going to modernize their identity platform. So I would say the first starting point is the risk reduction, and identity modernization should materially reduce the exposure, not just add more authentication steps. I mean, I guess that's kind of obvious, but it's something that you really need to, the framing that you need to think about. Move toward phishing resistant authentication and stronger identity assurance models. So it's one thing to add multi-factor authentication, great, but if it's not phishing resistant, then you're not really getting at the core of the problem. So reduce dependence on shared secrets. Again, so some modern multi-factor authentication solutions rely on shared secrets like OTP, and fragile recovery workflows. Start with the notion that your security posture, which translates to digital trust, hinges on recovery workflows. To put it simply, the solution is really only as strong as the weakest link, which is often the credential recovery. So, think of ways that you can focus on reducing the probability and the blast radius of account compromise. Because at the end of the day, you are going to have recovery workflows. You can't avoid that. So, you kind of want to think on the other side of that problem. How can you reduce the blast radius? Security teams, I think, increasingly need the confidence in who's accessing the systems. Kind of goes back to the point that you made about visibility. The last point is, I think that's worthy and is dedicated, and probably, it's worthy of a dedicated webinar in the future. And you've been circling around the topic a few times through this conversation, is that identity becomes especially important when we talk about AI agents, right? And automation and delegated workflows. This is really crucial. So let's go ahead and move to user experience. Do you want to take that one, Nikki?
Yeah, definitely. And I am going to make one comment. I have seen tons of strong authentication beat by weak password reset, right? Or I'll say password reset, but weak credential reset, whatever it might be, right? You can go add tons of passkeys and push authentication, right? And then all of a sudden somebody goes through I forgot my credential flow, or I got a new phone flow. And it's just like, hey, what's your dog's name? Right? And all of a sudden it's the early 2000s again. And I'm like, let me just guess my dog's name real quick.
It reminds me of that scene in Indiana Jones. I don't know if you remember, but where the guy with the sword, and he's wielding around the sword. And then Indiana Jones pulls out the gun and shoots the guy.
Yep.
It reminds me exactly of that.
Yep. No, that's what I think of all the time. And funny enough about that scene, completely improvised, by the way. So the I would say, if we compare the directors and stuff to the IAM team, right? They didn't see it coming. That was completely improvised. That was Harrison Ford. He came up with that idea. He's like, Indy wouldn't do that. He would just do this, right? This is what a hacker would do.
Yeah, that's great.
So great comparison, great comparison. But I've seen it all the time, right? And all of a sudden, you're back in the early 2000s again. And at this point in time, a hacker probably has a better chance of guessing my dog's name when I set that account up than I do. I would probably fail the KBAs at this point in time. And I think that leans into the user experience that you had up there, right? That's if even if I went through that flow, that'd be a bad user experience for me, right? I'd be like, wait a minute, what's my dog's name? I just have to call somebody at this point in time. But user experience is very important, especially if if your organization is a customer focused organization, right? External, normal people, not just B2B, but even in the B2B world, right? Basically everything but employees, that might be a better way to say it. User experience is extremely important, right? There are so many services out there, and as a company, you want to provide the best service to the people that are utilizing your service, right? It's the oldest thing about business in the world. You have to be better than everyone else's service, especially as things get commoditized at the end of the day, right? So that user experience is going to feed right into it, right? If it's aggravating to get into an application, right, to use your service, users are going to move on to something else. I think the biggest example of this, right, and I'm going to pick on them because they're the other extreme, right? Retail. When's the last time anyone on this call has logged into Amazon?
Mm.
That once, right? Maybe if you got a brand new computer, you logged in a second time. And why is that, right? They look at it and say, all right, user experience. If I add any more friction to the front end of this, the users are just going to go to Walmart and buy something wherever it might be, right? And then, of course, we have the other extreme of the place, right? Banking. Banks are like, okay, we have to have all of the security possible, but we still need to figure out, how much is too much aggravation for the user, right? And every single business is somewhere between in that spectrum, right? They have to balance out that user experience, but also provide better security for their end users. Otherwise, they'll just move along,
Yeah,
right? So,
yeah,
to me,
absolutely.
things like Passkeys, that's where you start moving into being able to have both very good user experience, WebAuthn as well, right? I don't want to pick on it too bad especially I have a newer Apple, right? And a newer Windows computer and just touch the little touch ID there and do WebAuthn. But both of those together, right? Great user experience is also super strong at the end of the day.
Yeah. And I wanted to highlight something that you mentioned. I thought was interesting because you bring up the Amazon case and how, you really don't authenticate that often. Yet somehow we kind of trust it, right? I mean, we don't really think twice about, oh, somebody's gonna, hack into my account and run up my credit card, which by the way is kept by Amazon too. So I think there's kind of something to be said for that, in that when you have an authentication experience or a security system or something there that is frictionless and smooth, you kind of begin to establish trust in the background, and I think that's kind of something that's interesting and important to underline as well. I'm going to take us to our next topic, which is around operational efficiency. And many organizations, they're carrying years of accumulated identity complexity. Uh, like I said before, fragmented systems, inconsistent workflows, overlapping policies, what have you. And operational simplicity really isn't just about reducing the IT burden. It's about improving the scalability, the governance, the organization's ability to evolve safely. Um, as you kind of touched on, complexity eventually becomes, a security liability and an innovation bottleneck, right? It becomes a friction, and the more complex things become, the slower that the organization is going to move. It's kind of like driving in mud. Um, so I think identity teams, I mean, this is obvious, but I think identity teams should really spend less time maintaining fragmented identity infrastructure and more time enabling business initiatives. Okay, easier said than done. But one thing I would emphasize is that organizations in doing this, they think beyond authentication solutions as point products or as just a solution for authentication, and think about how the identity journey is managed holistically across the full credential lifecycle. And while today's conversation has intentionally been framed across the broader industry mindset rather than us talking about specific products or solutions. I would be remiss, I think, if I didn't highlight why, to me, the HID and Ory partnership is particularly compelling in this space. On the one hand, you have Ory, which brings this powerful modular API identity and access management platform. And this gives organizations the flexibility in how they modernize authentication and authorization. And you can speak to this better than I can. But when you combine that with HID's deep history and trusted credentials for both physical and logical access, along with the digital services that we provide around those credentials, you start addressing much more than just authentication itself. You start addressing kind of this broader credential journey, like procurement, issuance, inventory management, lifecycle management, the governance, the recovery, and just kind of this long-term operational control, within the organization. And I think that broader operational perspective becomes increasingly important as identity environments continue growing more complex, right?
Yeah, I totally agree. And to me, right, it's always to say that consistency is key, right?
Mm.
Consistency is key, and especially when it comes to these different credentials, when we talk about the end users that have to utilize these. I mean, you're bringing up the partnership, right? I'll tell my anecdotal story about the partnership, right? My wife is a nurse. On her badge, there are 5 different physical credentials, and then on top of that, she also has 2 different digital credentials on her phone for when she's logging in to like check her email or check her schedule and stuff like this. And she's always asking me, she's like, why? And I'm like, well, technically because no one's ever integrated these 2 things together before. But now we do have the I would say the technology and the ability to do that, right? That it's catching up, and we should be on the forefront of putting those 2 things together. A long time ago, when you had that physical access card, right, and you'd walk up to the door and you go beep beep, let me in, right? You used to not be able to use your phone with that. Right, you used to not be able to. So there was a reason, right? Physical access. You had a card. It was just easier for that was frictionless back then, right? For end users, and they could go into the thing. But you never could use that for the digital side of the house because the digital side just didn't have those scanners. But now it does, right? Like if you think about most of the time, if you're checking your schedule or checking your email or whatever, you're doing that on your phone. Let's just being honest for the way that they operate, right? I do know her phone has the ability to scan NFC. I do that all the time with my phone, right? Which means that we can actually start combining these 2 different worlds, right? Where it's just like, hey, that credential, that's a very strong credential that you think about. It's one of the strongest credentials that you can get is when you have that HID badge, because it's a badge, which means you went physically picked it up because it was to physically get in the building. So you're getting, identity assurance, right? Because it's tied directly to your employer looking at it, tied directly to your I-9, right? So it also tied directly to you walking in and showing your other employee badge, the one that's just used for flashing, and your driver's license. That's an extremely strong credential. And it's going to be very exciting to see when you can start using that in other places, especially, even if it is just on the employee side, at least being able to use that in other places where it becomes consistency. And for them, that'll start being more frictionless because they'll know that it's always just one, right? Even though it's still one, it's always just one. That consistency is key for it to start being a frictionless. So I'm pretty excited about it. But I also think maybe I'm just a little bit of a nerd when it comes to that, but I am pretty excited about it. And then of course, all the risk signals that you can get from it, right? Hey, how are you logging in from the computer at the work desk when you didn't scan into the front badge? That's a risk signal at the end of the day. And that's what we're all looking for, is all these different risk signals. You start adding those together, you start getting a picture of what the user's doing, or a picture of visibility and different gaps that you might have inside of your organization. But to do that, your platform has to be flexible, right? Whatever that you're using today has to be flexible. And if it's not, right, it's going to be another bolt-on, another bit of custom code, right? So platform flexibility is going to be key going forward, especially as all of these different spaces start to evolve. Picking on the AI part, because it's the newest one, no one's really picked on exactly how identity for agents should work. Right. And I don't mean just like the identifying it and doing access control. That part, they've got some really good ideas, but how does an agent authenticate, right? We still haven't really all settled on how machine to machine should authenticate, right? Or non-human identity, since marketing decided to come up with a new word. Some people are leaning on, just off machine to machine credentials. Some people are leaning on maybe we do something like Spiffy Spire. It should be done that way. Maybe it should be cryptographic completely, right? Some good old X509 stuff from back in the day. But whatever that settles on, the good news is if your platform's flexible, that's all about consuming different credentials at the end of the day, right? Each one of those is just, I don't care if you're using X509 to send in an identity cert, right? If you're using mutual TLS, if you're going full Spiffy Spire, if you're going machine to machine credentials, right? All of those are credentials, and your platform just needs the ability to be able to consume those credentials, figure out should they be trusted, right? X509, check the root, right? Check the root, check the CRLs, right? If we want to talk about the username and password, or I'm sorry, client ID and secret, machine to machine tokens, right? Verify those, right? Same thing when you want to go backwards for an end user flow. Let's say an end user has kicked something off and you want to verify that the agent should be able to do it on that user's behalf, right? If you want to go to scanning those badges, using those hard credentials that come from HID, right? Your platform just needs to be flexible to be able to trust these credentials, because that's all a credential is at the end of the day, right? It's ability to establish trust between an entity, whether it be an end user or a machine, and the global, if you will, IAM infrastructure that's going to do the enforcement on whether or not that credential should be able to take those actions. So flexibility is going to be key as they move forward.
Yep. And when I was listening to you speak there, Mickey, you were talking about platform flexibility, but at the same time, you were really also talking about future readiness. And I think you already touched on many of the points, to have a platform that's ready for future readiness. Identity modernization shouldn't just solve today's authentication problems. It should also be flexible enough to adapt as the environment continues to change. Passkeys, they are a major shift, but it's not going to be the last shift. And you said it. Basically, organizations are already preparing for AI-driven workflows, machine identities, which come with evolving trust models. And this is increasingly increasingly dynamic authorization requirements are evolving to serve the needs of automation. And future readiness is really about avoiding, rigid architectures that become tomorrow's modernization problem. You need to have something that's flexible, as we just discussed in the previous one. So you kind of get this lens, and you get an idea of what business leaders should be prioritizing. And also, I think this is another area where, modularity and lifecycle thinking become important. And I know we already talked on the Ory and HID relationship, but again, organizations are increasingly, they have to evolve incrementally rather than, having this rip and replace approach. So, that's one area where, Ory, I think, can really help out. And I think the broader adaptability is ultimately what future readiness is all about, right?
Yeah.
So, anything you want to add to that, or?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great point, right? And that's, I guess I'll dive a little bit deeper into the Ori architecture, but that's why Ori was built the way it is, right? The marketing terms are all about, it's cloud ready, right? Or it's cloud native. At the end of the day, what that really means is that when we were constructing Ori here, what we had done was broken apart your traditional access management server into smaller piece components, and made sure that those components could always work together. So if you had one, it was fine. If you had two, it was fine. What that really means is things like when we think about machine-to-machine identities or agent identities, right? If that does rely on OAuth, we'll say if it does, right? And you're utilizing Ori, that means that you can just deploy, in our case, we call it Hydra. You can just deploy Hydra, and you could scale Hydra completely independent of all the other identity stack that you have inside of your system. Another product I'll just bring up, Keto permissions, right? That's the fine grain authorization reback model, if anyone's familiar with it, right? You might not be doing a lot of fine grain stuff, so you could just throw two Ketos out there and have it scaling to meet your workload. But all of a sudden, you could switch over to doing, fine grain to the nth degree. So you need 30 Ketos and only 10 Hydras, right? But you might not need the rest of the components, right? And that comes into the flexibility, making sure that you can fill the gaps that you have today without ripping out what you might already have for your identity stack. If your employees are already authenticating against Entra ID in this case, 'cause that's very popular these days in digital identity. Hopefully, you might just authenticate against HID, as it now that it has the physical credentials and the integration with Ory, right? But you keep that, right, and then just use Hydra for the agentic flows, the machine-to-machine flows, because it'll scale faster, and then as you go, you can evolve into that. But one thing I
Excellent.
will say is with this convergence of all this going on, especially between HID and Ory and the digital and the physical world, I don't know anything about what you guys are doing with AI over there, Caleb, but I hope that whatever it is, whenever you do a demo of it, that, at one point in time, it says, like, somebody scans their badge and it's like, I'm sorry, Dave, I can't do that.
Yeah, so I think this is a good part to close out, and hopefully, one of the key takeaways today is that identity modernization is no longer a technical upgrade discussion. It's something that really impacts security, user experience, operational efficiency, business agility as we start looking forward. And I think I'm really getting the sense, Mickey, based on this discussion and how many times that it came up. I think next time we might want to spend a little bit more time, perhaps unpacking some of the topics that we briefly touched upon today, that warrant more attention. So perhaps around, I don't know, agentic identity and how AI-driven automation is reshaping the authorization landscape. Because ultimately, if you think about it, many of these future challenges, they still collapse back to the core question of trust, which is, who's allowed to do what under which conditions. So I think that could easily be a future topic of discussion. With that, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. And hopefully this session gave you a perspective, and it's useful to see where the market is heading and what organizations should prioritize as they're moving forward. Thanks, everyone.